I'm happy to be here again. I've, I think, spoken at every Layer 123 Congress except the October 16th SDN World Congress in The Hague for a personal conflict, and for the first Madrid conference a little over a year ago. So I'm always happy to be here and try to address the real problems with some real tangible steps towards solving them. So what I'm going to talk about today is this question of automating services and abstracting services with, in particular, a focus on concatenating services between operators. I'll talk about the East-West APIs, the abstractions they represent, and how they're used to automate services within an operator domain over multiple technologies and multiple vendors, but also between operators. And we call this sort of a DevOps approach because we were just a pure standards organization some years ago, but now we're doing some combination of standards and open source, and I'll explain that. I'll concentrate on what the APIs really represent. So I want to talk about who cares about this, why it matters, and then the lifecycle service orchestration, the framework and the APIs we have with a focus on the East-West APIs. A little bit about standards versus software, and then, of course, a little bit more about standards and software together. So, go back. We had a vertical systems group conduct a survey among, I think, nearly 100 telcos. We have over 100 in MEF on what does it take to become a digital service provider? Why do you want to do it? And what is inhibiting you from making progress on that? And these are the top answers to those two most important questions. What's driving you there? And the answer is we want to provision services faster. By provision, it means create them, put them up, take them down, manage them, even for small segments of customers and individual customers. The money that a telco gets is from selling services. So this is on the revenue improvement side. We saw some charts yesterday about where revenue is going and where costs are going. And there's an unfortunate crossover looming for a number of telcos if they don't solve a little bit the cost problem, more importantly, the revenue problem. So that's number one. On the other side, what's preventing you from doing this? Well, many of the prominent operators have customers whose desire for connectivity and services extends beyond the boundary of just their one local operator. This is especially true for the smaller operators. So how do they deploy this over multiple operators in the same automated and agile fashion? And so that's the concerns they express. So we've been working on how to address those concerns. So MEF started out doing carrier Ethernet, which was pretty radical in its time. A couple of versions of that. Still a static service, and it was not agile and not orchestrated. So we developed this framework called LSO, Lifecycle Service Orchestration, and that has expanded now to include this whole, what we call MEF 3.0, Global Services Framework, which applies to a variety of services, multiple interfaces, new forms of certification, and a much larger community we've gotten out of our own silo. So on the left, you'll see the services quadrant, and we started with carrier Ethernet. Well, once we figured out how to make carrier Ethernet agile, assured, and orchestrated, we said, why don't we apply those same principles and mechanisms to services beyond layer 2? So we've gone down into layer 1 optical, layer 3 IP VPNs. We're doing SD-WAN, the first industry specifications for SD-WAN services later this year. And then security as a service layered initially on top of SD-WAN, and then other applications and intent-based services. So a much broader array of services. The LSO APIs I will talk about at great length this morning, and then not much on certification except that it's become cloudified for both technologies and services, and then a larger community that we have to collaborate with, especially with regards to other standards and open source projects. So you can look up MEF 55, and it's very easy to understand. This is the Lifecycle Service Orchestration Reference Architecture. We have a customer on the left, we have their local service provider in the middle, and then we have a partner service provider on the right for reaching areas that the local service provider does not reach. I might have a footprint in this part of this country, but I don't go to South Africa, for example, so I have to partner with others. We've defined these abstracted notions of business applications, service orchestration, infrastructure control, and element control. These are not randomly chosen. These are well-chosen abstractions that many things can fit into, and when we define them as abstractions and separate them by well-defined APIs, shown here with these musical terms, we enable an operator to implement any one of these functions however they wish without worrying about either the changes rippling up and down their stack or they're being dependent on what some other operator might have chosen in the same area. It's been especially useful for things like SDN and SD-WAN as examples of infrastructure control and management. If you have an orchestrator that talks Presto and you have the SDN controller, the SD-WAN controller, or legacy products with that same interface on their northbound side, then you can have a common orchestration mechanism over a variety of technologies and a variety of transport networks without having to care about the details of the underlying technologies. Now, this is something that Saad was expressing a need for. He is not the only one. The entire industry has this need. So we have 3 north-south APIs there: Legato, Presto, and Adagio, and then 4 east-west ones. But the 4 east-west ones have quite a lot of parallels. Cantata and Sonata are very similar. One comes from a customer, the other is between operators. And this is really for service establishment, and I'll talk about that in more detail. And then Allegro and Interlude as east-west, again between one from the customer, the other between operators. This is for ongoing management of a service once it is set up. And they're quite similar. The important ones we'll discuss today are Sonata. I'll talk maybe a little bit about Presto. It's being widely adopted in things like ONAP, Open Daylight, and things like that. Presto, yes. So for the East-West APIs, we started with a set of objectives. What are we trying to accomplish? We really want to automate interoperability among operators, service providers, so they can offer services and concatenate them in an automated fashion. We've seen some examples of this at our annual conferences, MEF 18 and MEF 17, where multiple operators set up a service, got it running, ran it, took it down, got paid for it, in minutes rather than months. Particularly with the API structure, we rely a lot on a model-based approach. You heard a lot about modeling from Francisco Javier on Monday, and probably hear more today, and from a number of other parties. If you're not model-based, then it's really hard to be extensible. So we use those, and we'll talk about how we collaborate on some of those models. And we work closely with the TM Forum and others on that. And then the API structure, we really want to make it sort of a lot of standard pieces that everyone can agree on and extensions where it is needed. And then we need the flexibility because no one yet knows what services might be thought of or created as the needs arise from their customers and as the ability to offer differentiated services permeates down the stack, mostly thanks to the abstractions of NFV and SDN. So we do work most closely, I think, with the TM Forum because they define all these REST-based APIs. And they're essentially payload and service agnostic. We fill in those details. So we have code points for specific services. We're the payloads that define these things. And there's a lot of detail in these, and I'll get into that in a bit. But it's a really good partnership with them. And Joanne was here yesterday, and she's been almost in a critical liaison between our organizations to do this in the right way. So they have a whole lot of templates, and we fill in the details, and we occasionally have to do extensions, and we feed those back to TM Forum in case they need to be really a new major definition of some kind of API. So this is our model, and we have a common services model here. I've just circled the ones of the interfaces, the APIs that are involved in this, and they're all 4 east-west ones, plus the Legato north-south from essentially the BSS down to the orchestration function. And you can see on the left side that these are intended to support all of the services under this common model and with these reference points. And talk a little bit about some of the attributes and the relationships. But we really have to start with something that can be modeled simply, but can also be then fleshed out and detailed for the particular needs of the different services that our operators need to offer. So we have these relationships, and there's a lot of common things here you'll see in modeling and inheritance. And I won't go into the details of these, but we have this common service model and a MEF common core model that we have tried to use. Now, everyone wants a core model to be perfect, and architecturally pure, and live forever. It's very hard to do that and to meet the needs of current businesses. So we have struggled with this a little bit with some of our collaborators, such as the Linux Foundation projects. How perfect can you make a core model while still being able to get there from here with services you want to launch now? So we've had to be practical about this, and it's one of those things that those of us in standards have learned sometimes the hard way, which is that sometimes better is the enemy of good enough. So this collaboration has centered a lot on the projects that have deadlines, such as ONAP. We also, of course, work with OSM. And the way we've structured this, you can have an implementation of a service orchestration or the business or BSS services, and then the infrastructure control. And you can collaborate or have a service extended to somebody else across, say, the Sonata and Interlude APIs, and not care whether their orchestrator is ONAP or OSM or OpenBaton or OpenNef or something entirely proprietary. We've actually demonstrated some of these where an entire service was run across the world where ONAP was in one operator and something proprietary was in another. Another case where we had ONAP talking to ONAP and other people are doing it with OSM. The important thing is that operator A doesn't need to do the same thing as operator B, and in fact doesn't even have to know what operator B is doing in their orchestration function. The same way they don't really care what their lower layer infrastructure looks like or how it is implemented. That's the nice thing about choosing the right APIs. And API sort of implies a top-down application programming interface. And East-West, it's really more of an interface, but the concept is similar and the structure is identical. So let's just look at Sonata here. I've shown it at the top. This is how one service provider can extend a service through another service provider, and not by taking 6 months to write contracts and exchange Excel spreadsheets, but in an automated fashion that goes completely electronically and can be done in seconds and minutes. So here's an example. You've got somebody in the United States and somebody in the United Kingdom, or maybe soon to be England only. The retail and wholesale service providers, they want to set this up, and they have to establish that the service is available, that it's at a particular address. They want to know what it costs, what else might be in the catalog, how do I pay for it, and things like this. And so this has actually been demonstrated and is being put into use. And so when we publish an API such as Sonata, what do we actually produce? What are our deliverables in MEF? So we have these things here, and the requirements and use cases are examples of the attributes you have to convey across the Sonata API. Product serviceability, is it available there? What does it cost to quote? How do I order it? What is the inventory of other services? And then you can see this is done through the formal definition of what we call an interface profile specification, which includes the information model, and an interface implementation specification, which includes these other particular details. So we have the schema here. Some stuff is common, some stuff is custom. That's up to the operator. But the API gives you the flexibility of doing that. So we have a very formal process for issuing these things. But there's more to it than issuing specs. And you can see that it's a rich interface. The Sonata is captured the interest of many operators and has been demonstrated and will be demonstrated again this fall at MEF 19. I'll invite you all to that at the very end. And you can see there's a lot of things here we have to release. So this is not just we publish one PDF. This is a series of releases, and they start with something that is a text document, but you can see it goes beyond that. And there are just many facets, and this is only Sonata. So when you look at the 7 APIs for different services, it's quite a rich set of things we have to produce, and we're doing it on a schedule. And initially, we would issue a specification, and great, it would go out there, and developers would implement it however they wish. They expected the specification to be perfect, so we took a long time getting it right, and we said, go and have at it. If it had to be implemented in silicon, for example, you better make sure it's right when it goes out, because it costs, a fortune to turn a new chip. Well, this is how it has been for 100 years. Issue the standards, and then you do the implementations, and the standards have to be perfect. Well, we now have standards and software working collaboratively together, so we do issue the APIs in formal specifications of pros, an information model, and a data model, which is executable. We're also issuing open source SDKs, software development kits. And we do these before the API formal specifications are final. All right, here's what it looks like. Here's an SDK. Go play with it. Feedback the results and the experience. See what you can do with it. And we use an agile sprint framework, practice for doing this. Believe me, we don't think we're the first in any of this stuff, because the computing industry has been doing this for 30 years. Networking is just getting word of what you can do with agile software development. But we're using it to our advantage. And frankly, we had a struggle with issuing a spec before it was perfect. And this was a cultural battle that we fought, part of our own journey to digital transformation inside MEF itself and in the community that we serve. But we've gotten past that point. So now we issue a spec when it's ready to be implemented in SDK. We put out the SDK, and then we play with it. We iterate back on the spec itself. So we used to just do things for the business people and maybe the IT architect, but now we're including the designer and the developer. You can see we've got the developer guide, we got Swagger, we have a Postman. So we actually publish these things, and we use the types of, modeling languages and a set of modeling tools, and the tooling is a very important part of the process, which we've tried to do in common with other organizations where we can. So this kind of stuff is new, but it's the only way to really get it right and take advantage of the fact that so many telco functions are implemented now in software. You get these control planes out of the appliances and into a server somewhere and into a data center, and suddenly the practices of computing and IT take over. So we're just really getting on the bandwagon that has been established already in computing. So my summary is this, that to make the industry agile itself and adapt to the needs of the market, raise revenue, be creative in services, and collaborate across the globe, we've had to take on these abstractions. They didn't come easily. It took a while to get them right, but I think they have now proven themselves to be very useful abstractions. So they do accelerate innovation, and they promote choice in the technologies that implement any of the abstracted notions that we have defined. The East-West APIs are really the best vehicle we have found for inter-carrier automation. And because they can be done really through an automated portal from a customer and their own APIs, you can really start with the customer and get a worldwide service established across the globe without any people getting deliberately involved. And this is starting to happen. We still issue specifications. Standards are important. They have to be trusted, and we continue to do that with great care. But we also find now that software helps us make better specifications. And especially when the specifications will be implemented almost entirely in software, let's use software as a tool to improve the specifications. So I call this DevOps for standards. Standards and software iterating back and forth with each other. We put it into practice. It's a regular part of what we do in MEF, and we think it's helping the industry move much more quickly. So I never would have said this even 2 years ago, certainly not before that software now is a standards best friend, and we think this will continue. I'm happy to answer any questions. Alan, get a microphone so it goes on to the tape that people can watch later.
Thank you for your presentation. My concern is coordinating amongst the various open source organizations. The ONAP, which when you were in the head of, despite my suggestions, didn't pursue an East-West interface. There's also the Linux Foundation, which has about 17 to 20 networking open source projects. And then there's the TMF, which, as we heard yesterday, doing these APIs. This brings up a larger question, which I'm going to address with the layer 1, 2, 3 people. But the question is, how do you coordinate this amongst the various open source organizations to avoid duplication, redundancies, et cetera?
Yeah, so that's really important for us to consider. And by the way, I do have one more slide I want to show at the end. So we do this in two ways, a top-down way and a bottom-up way. So we meet with the leaders of the open source organizations, discuss strategy and what's needed. And then bottom-up is from the members themselves. The only way to get anything done in an open source project is to contribute code.
Right, I know that.
So we've got companies that are members of MEF and of Linux Foundation or ETSI or others, and so they will, or IETF, and they will contribute code, they'll contribute use cases, they'll marshal support among other colleagues in those organizations to move them forward through their processes. But I mean, for example, we hosted a meeting on information models with ONAP, the TM Forum, ETSI, and ONF. We actually hosted it next to our office in Los Angeles to hammer out what do we do in time for the deadlines that ONAP was facing. And the only way to do it really is face-to-face with people or people who know each other and to work collaboratively using the electronic collaboration tools that we all use. But you're right, it is a deliberate effort. You can't go off in your silo and you can't toss things over a transom and expect other people to implement them. You have to work with them to make those things happen. On this slide, I just wanted to invite you all to our public conference. You know, we have 4 member meetings a year, but they're for members. We have a public conference every fall. This will be in Los Angeles again, and it's a large conference. And the most exciting part of it is the POC showcase. We have proofs of concept. We limit it to 20. Requires at least 3 parties, so there are operators all over the globe. They do amazing things. Anything related to MEF 3.0, a lot of facets of that. But you know, we've had this extended carrier service take up, take down, pay for using blockchain. We've had markets created using blockchain. We've had 5G to remote endpoints. We've had 5G doing servicing medical care for refugees in Greece. All kinds of stuff turns up there. So we would love to have your participation. You don't actually have to be a member to be in a POC. There's a fee for everyone, but it's the same. So we would welcome your participation in that as well. Are there other questions?
Just one quick
yeah,
thing. For the layer 1, 2, 3, please raise your hand if you're with layer 1, 2, 3. So I have a very, very strong suggestion. This was a very, very refreshing conference for me because instead of hype, we got people talking about real problems that they experienced. And what is missing from this conference, which I suggest we have at 3 o'clock or whenever it ends, is a panel session where some of the experts can address these problems. For example, what is SDN anymore? I don't remember, it was a LinkedIn or email exchange with Roy about that. I have no idea. I've been involved in it for 10 years. What is SDN? And then Saad called attention to some huge, huge problems. So, well, gosh, 75% of 5G is going to be a Cloud RAN. Well, there's 5 consortiums doing Cloud RAN. And then the next one is have open source consortiums become de facto standards organizations, which we were discussing at breakfast. And it appears that they have been. And what are the conventional standards organizations doing about that, including IEEE, who I represent, and ITU? Are they all asleep? So anyway, can we discuss that informally?
So yeah, and I have
and the ones that I'd like is the 3 people that I want on the panel: Roy, Christos, and no, let me tell you about Christos, and of course Dan. But Christos, about 10 years ago,
It's odd, too.
said that, oh, NFE is here now. He's one of the guys who invented NFE. He took it to Etsy. Doesn't want to admit that now. But he said, no, it's not wrong. So he said, this was at a light reading conference about 8 years ago. And he said, oh, see this hardware, all this hardware, it's all obsolete. It's all going to be replaced by virtual appliances. Well, you said today we need a hardware load balancer. We need a dedicated load balancer. But he had in this picture, load balancer, whatever. Well, anyway. That's why the before and after, that's why we need to have him on the panel. Okay? And if you want, I can moderate it. I can ask the questions. Right?
Right.
I got
We
50
might do
years.
that. No, Roy has an appointment, but
I got
we'll talk
50
about it.
years experience doing that. And if you look up my name, you'll see hundreds of videos. All right, that's all I have to say.
So one partial answer to that is that Layer 123 has pioneered something toward that effect, which is to conduct what we call a multiplayer workshop. Used to be you'd go to a conference and on the day before there's a workshop and Etsy has one, and OSM and ZSM has it, and 3GP and MEF and ONAP, and they're like 7 different workshops. They're all in parallel. They each have 12 people, and you can only go to one. And so we've taken to doing a multiplayer workshop where everybody comes in and talks for about a half an hour. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're doing. They can say, well, wait a second, they're doing that. What about you? So we had one here. We had one in Madrid. We're going to have one in The Hague in October. That's a big flagship. Everybody should go to that. It's going to be at least as big as MEF 19. And so that's one way we're trying to combat all running off in other directions. I want to thank you all.